Okay, welcome to Sense Based Podcast. I'm here today with Daniel Zaruba, a philosopher, a really important participant in the emergent school of Dialogos, the invisible college of philosophy existing beyond the academy. And he's been doing his own YouTube channel for the last 2 years. He's been in dialogue with a lot of really great philosophers and is currently leading a course on Dialogos and Japanese philosophy. So really great to have you here, Daniel. We had our first conversation last month, and I'm really looking forward to picking up some of the threads with you today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and for having me on your podcast. I'm also looking forward a lot to our conversation.
Awesome. So you are in Vienna, or just outside Vienna, is that right?
Yeah, I live south of Vienna in a very small town.
Cool. So we are both in small towns, and I think you're a few hours east of me. I'm now in Germany, and I wanted to start out just talking with you a little bit about how your journey with philosophy shifted as you came into this space of Dialogos. I know we were talking before that you had a really deep journey with the texts in relationship to Nietzsche and various other philosophers, but now you've sort of shifted into this space of dialectic, Dialogos, and you're actually beginning to work on the pedagogy of these practices. So what's that sort of shift been like, and how are they interacting for you now?
Yeah, so I've been interested in, let's say, problems like nihilism, existentialism, the problem of science and religion for a long time. And when this, let's call it this space in the internet, began to emerge with people like, at the beginning, Jordan Peterson, then later John Vervaeke, and others like Guy Sangstock, Christopher Mastropietro, or Johannes Niederhauser. So I'm teaching in his Halykon Academy. I've taught a course on the Kyoto School philosopher Nishitani Keiji before on his major work, Religion and Nothingness. That was last summer. And this time we are doing a course on Japanese philosophy and Dialogos together. When I came into this space, I was just curious about what's going on here, really. I was just very fascinated by the dialogues that took place, let's say, the culture that was going on. I was just really fascinated by it. And then I took one of Johannes's, actually his first course, I think his second course, that was called Idleness with Dignity, Otium cum dignitate. It had to do with this problem of what the Greeks call scholae, which the word school is coming from. I also had Greek and Latin in high school, so I've always maintained a deep appreciation for antiquity. And those Johannes's courses were really great. And he even said, that is what I'm doing, that is what university should be like. But sadly, that is often not offered in universities any longer. So we try to just hold open this space where we can philosophize very freely. And maybe I'll also say this, just in the last couple of months, our seminars are all very long. They're all like 3.5 hours. We usually just written like 2 hours, like that's fine. But we usually we stop when it's like the participants, when there's when we are all silent and fall back into silence and everything has been said. But we are very free in that sense, how we keep open the seminars, and we're very generous there with the time. So yeah, I'm just very grateful that I can be a participant in this emergent thing. And yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of reading about the Greeks and sort of the way in which they would gather at somebody's house and sit in the lounge chairs and really just go at it and drink the wine and philosophize for hours and hours and hours. And it speaks to just how vital and enjoyable this practice of philosophy is, that you can just go on for hours and hours, as you say. Yeah.
And maybe it's saying a little bit now about the Dialogos practices. So starting with Guy Sangstock, he really, I would say, initiated this. He tried to, he invited me and a couple of others, so that we just try out some of these practices that also John was promoting, for example, philosophical fellowship, or later dialectic into Dialogos. And what I've now tried with this course is that we have 4 seminars which are explicitly dedicated to combining reading a text, study of a philosophical text, with a dialogical practice. And that then also in the seminar in little groups where we do those dialogical practices together. Those things make maybe not so much sense intuitively. So Dialogos and Japanese philosophy, there's still a kind of like a gap. But it's cool because the practices can really help you to discover deeper layers of the texts that you may not get if you're just reading for information. So it's reading for transformation, not just for information. And when you come with that attitude to the practices and the courses, there's really wonderful things are going on. I can say this. People report, just what people report is, right, that they are very intimacy. Some even have, right, almost mystical experiences when they are doing this kind of stuff. So it's really catchy in that sense, and that's just what is very cool about this. So you don't have to do the practices, the dialogical practices, with Japanese texts of Japanese philosophy. You can do them with any text, basically. In the seminars with John and Guy and Chris, we did this with a couple of, for example, with the philosophical fellowship with a couple of sages like Buber, Carl Jung, Plato, Kierkegaard, Meister Eckhart, just to name a few. And that's just a really cool practice if you are already inclined in a philosophical sense, but you want to get out of monological argumentation and endless speculation that often feels more like your rumination. Then those dialogical practices where you come to a text in this very practical, praxis-oriented way is just very cool, really cool. And it also helps you to foster and foster your dialogical capacities. And I think that's also perhaps the most important thing, because when you look at academics today, how they argue often, and it's not really a dialogue, it's more like I have a monologue, and right, it's that spirit of argumentation does not allow us to get to deeper points where we can then really start making sense together. And that is really apparent if you look at the often how academic discussions play out.
Yes. Yeah. It's really, it feels to me like a sort of paradigm shift in conversation. And when I was recently watching a podcast with some sort of older classical academics having a conversation, it was so striking to me to see this distinction of like a conversation where it is sort of, maybe it's not a debate, but it's still sort of in this debate style in a sense. There isn't any attention to the relationship as being an important aspect of the dialogue. And there's not really any sense of like the embodiment that's going on, like all of these layers of sensitivity and attunement that allow us to begin to actually presence and feel these philosophical ideas and virtues. Now we're seeing this whole other conversational paradigm where it's like we're talking about something, but we're also really paying attention to how we come into relationship and how we tend to the ground of the conversation and so on. So that's like a really radical shift that I think would be really powerful in the academy. Like one of my little dreams, I suppose, is that someday this kind of Dialogos, transformative dialogue practices will seed back into the universities. I was a university debater competitively when I was at university, so very much embedded in that approach where it wasn't about what was true or what we felt was true. It was about what could we beat the other side with in a really hyper rationalistic way.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to do whatever. But I mean, if you just look at America, I mean, America is a very crass example in this sense, because when you have, for example, political debate and they all, whether you're left or right, they're all in their echo chambers. And just talking with people who kind of like share the same worldview, the same perspective, and there's no multi-perspectival overlap. And that is especially in that Dialogos practice, that is what could really emerge, that you can, that the different perspectives can amalgamate, can kind of like, or us stereoscope together in a greater, more encompassing fashion. But that is never possible under the circumstances we are, or debates often. For me, America is really, because there's really like right and left, and they're just fighting with each other. So,
yeah.
What do I want to say? And that is exacerbated by technology. That's the other point that's so salient and so striking in our time, because our technology just is such, right? Smartphones and YouTube algorithms are just designed in such a way that they kind of like they create those echo chambers by their algorithmic structures, and that's just
yeah.
we seem to, right, just getting more deeper and deeper into those loopholes where we just, and Dialogos is just a way to spiral out of that again into a more open, more inviting space and time where we can then come together again.
Yeah, I love that spiraling open, like suddenly from the reciprocal narrowing, this shift into, oh, there's an opening here, something is possible, something is not yet known. And I definitely concur with you that the possibility of Dialogos is far beyond far beyond something that just occurs amongst academic philosophers. And perhaps part of the breakdown of traditional academic philosophy has been that it's become this sort of retreat from the world in some sense, whereas this Dialogos seems to offer something that actually, if you practice it, is not just going to affect your capacity to engage in philosophy. It's going to flow out into your very relationship to life, and every conversation, political breakdown, family, friendship, all of these things can be enriched. Um, have you had a sense on your journey with Dialogos of how it sort of goes beyond the intentional dialogue and flows out into your own life in whatever ways?
Yeah, and the dialogues I'm having with people who kind of like come into this space, they are all amazing. I'm constantly amazed by kind of what's possible in dialogues. Really, I'm constantly amazed, and I'm sometimes then it just strikes me, right? And then I realize, well, most people aren't like that. They're actually right, because our dialogical capacities are in a sense also under attack by social media, etc. Right? Because instead of where you would usually right talk with each other, see each other's faces, there are now these apps, and they're kind of like they have kind of occupied that in between space. And yeah, no, it just like again, what for my own life, I mean, really the dialogues, I mean, when you come with the right spirit and you really want to practice this and you're open for that, then it just transforms slightly also the way you think, the ways you what you notice in other people. You get more, you cultivate a great attention for gestures, for imagery the other person is using. And you also become more curious. There's this greater sense of curiosity. What's going on there when you're doing something or when you're saying something? That's just, and then it's really about this style of inquiry that the dialectic in the Dialogos is affording, and that if this is really done correctly, you can midwife inexhaustibly. It's like you just discover layer upon layer upon layer, and there's always a beyond, because the structures of intelligibility that are holding us don't have a thing character, but also are no thingy, and they're always withdrawing and allowing for kind of smallness to shine through them. And that's very, very cool, I would say. that kind of right that can help us to always create new perspectives, create new convergences, create new relationships. It's this constant ongoing process of transformation in which we can participate in if we have the right kinds of practices and the right kind of attitude. And that's all. And that's not it's why we say often it's emergent, but at the same time it's something very old. It's just we have forgotten it. Socrates is in a sense embodying that spirit, and we can see and read this in the Platonic dialogues. But and then Plato and the Greeks have always been a kind of nurturing and nourishing force for our culture. But today is and that's maybe something we can talk about. Today, it's at least my opinion, we lose that access to antiquity more and more. I've seen it come back, for example, with John and Johannes. Because John Vervaeke, he's very much influenced by Plato. And I see it coming back a little bit. And I hope that there will be a revival of the Greeks. But yeah, this is it. Speaking from my point of view, in more and more schools, unfortunately, in Austria and Germany, in the past, you if you want to study in the humanities, you had to know Latin and Greek. That was just inevitable, and that was kind of you learned that in high school. You kind of like when in the 19th century you had to also write in Latin. This was kind of strict. But since I don't know when, since 20 years or so, we lose our appreciation for the ancient languages. And we try, we get more occupied with that kind of like vocational system, kind of like designed for just the economic system. And from what I know, they also try to interfere with the education plans. So let's get rid of things like art and poetry and Latin and Greek, because why we don't need those things.
Right.
They're not helpful, right? You don't need Greek at the modern workplace. You rather know I don't know, another programming language or something like that. But I see this movement becoming stronger in the last couple of years, and I hope we are not so foolish that we get rid of Greek and Latin completely. But I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and in my experience, it feels like because I was not educated at all in Latin or Greek, and England is famously a really poor country at foreign language study anyway. So much harder than to make the approach when that hasn't been offered at a younger age. But I do hope to one day make more of a foray into it. I'm always fascinated to learn the roots of words, and that's sort of been my doorway into a little bit of Latin here and there. Has been like seeing how it's often like a branching structure. You can have words like respiration and inspiration, and they both come down to inspirare, and it's like breathing in and breathing into, and there's fascinating ways in which the Latin words somehow seem to compound more meaning, or the meaning is somehow more grounded or less abstract, or it holds more. I can't really put words to it, but it's almost like a different ontology or something in the language.
Yeah, because the Greek, especially the Greek language as well, but the phenomena, just the sheer phenomena, just shine forth in a very salient quality in the Greek language. I mean, when we say, for example, the word idea, I think we all know what an idea is, but if you think long enough about the idea, you have actually no idea what an idea is. We have no clue. This is right in, I mean, I know not Jordan Peterson example. He quoted this all right from Carl Jung. It's not we don't have ideas; ideas have us, and so there are ideas, and where are they? What are they? That's, for example, what just Plato was very concerned about. That's a digression, but I compared to, for example, with my parents or people who did not have that education in Latin and Greek, it's just that whole layers of the language just remain alien to you. when I say some words that come from those two languages, and often my parents, for example, what does that actually mean? What we don't understand. Often these are loan words, and they make up the richness of our languages, the European languages. But that needs to be trained and cultivated. And I remember in high school, my German teacher said, if you study Latin, if you decide to go down this path and study Latin, it will change how you relate to language. It will change how you look at things. It will change how you look at the language. So you're kind of like retrained in that way. And that has actually happened with me, and that's really something that learning those languages can help you.
It feels to me there's a similarity between this and that sort of different ways of reading that you were talking about, like how we can, I recollect in particular how I used to read. I did a history bachelor's, and I was incredibly good at just sort of blitzing through a text and drawing out analytically. And then when I would go to read a philosophical text from that way of reading, I wouldn't really get it. And I had this experience where I read Being in Time, or at least I tried to read Being in Time, and then returned to a book that I had read once before, which was Carl Jung, Man and His Symbols. And as I was reading it again from that training that I had undergone, trying to understand Being in Time, suddenly I was like, each line of it, I was like really trying to get what he was talking about, and it became really psychoactive. And I felt like, oh, the unconscious, like I'm reading about it, but I'm actually beginning to have a feeling of it, like it's becoming present in my felt experience.
I mean, right? That's what you have taught today in academia on speed reading. So because you have to get through a lot of stuff if you work in the academia, and for example, one text, right, Religion Nothingness from Nishitani is one of those texts where I immediately slow down because I have to, because it's again psychoactive reading, participatory reading. You just won't get it if you read it fast. And that's the case with a great number of philosophical texts. Why we need to bring back again this practice of Lectio Divina, of sacred reading, where where reading is more embodied, more enactive, more imaginal. And the only thing I would say is, right, that all of that takes time. And sadly, that time is often not there in academia anymore, because other things are important. But those things require a lot of time. And at least for me, speaking personally, I've kind of like found that people were willing to give that time in this space of the internet, because there's a shared sense of there's really something at stake here. We need to bring those, let's say, also monastic traits of the education back, because modern universities do not have that monastic quality anymore. Although we have a lot of features, right? When you go to, in America or England, you go to college, right? You live in a dormitory, you live separated, but they are not, they have nothing like a monastic kind of touch to them anymore. They're more like party zones, right? So, but yeah, that's just, those practices are really vital for our culture. And it's great that there are a few people who want to bring them back.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sort of reconnecting the root of university as this sort of religious or spiritual monastic institution as well, and sort of re-wedding those things together is somehow a part of this, or part of the possibility of this, which even that word religion is already, I can feel the associations and so on, but there is something about when we step back from that and we talk about the quality of relationship, that sort of I thou relationship, that monastic relationship, that's really, I think, what makes this different from a secular normal academy, is that there is a real reverence for the texts and for the dialogue, and therefore for one another as well. And somehow, just in that way that we are reading the texts more slowly, more carefully, with different layers, so too with dialogue. We are listening more deeply, slowly, in a very different kind of way, that ultimately each of these together is making us sort of listen or read the world, read life in a different way. I know that you talked about a couple of the different ways that we can practice Dialogos. I wanted to throw a few more in, because I've been looking at what are the different ways we can do it. One of them you named is with a text, which is really, if you can find a beautiful philosophical extract or text and you can circle around that and draw it out with a group. The next one, which philosophical fellowship has also been associated with, is a virtue. So rather than a text, we have courage or care or listening or something like this, and we circle around that virtue and each draw in our own meaning of it, and then something beyond those meanings can occur. Then we have a totally idiosyncratic emergent dialogos, which for me is really bringing those skills to bear, those skills of listening, those skills of presence, without a fixed center, and really just moving with one another. And I think it really becomes about the coupling between the participants more than it is about the content, because the logos of the content might move around all these different directions, and it will be our coupling together that ultimately affords that. So I think that's sort of where we're at. I wonder if there are any more sort of ways of doing this that you've come across, or if that feels like a fairly good set.
No, that sounds very good. I'm also right. This is emerging for me. Maybe there are even other things we will discover in the next couple of months or years together when this project, with all the people who are involved in it, and it kind of like it starts to blossom. I think we're just right at the beginning of all of this. I hope so, at least.
Yeah. Yes, and that for me sort of brings in as you said, there is this revival, this return of something originary in it, but I also feel there's something new, and it's sort of both at the same time. It's as if Socrates was constantly bringing people to the edge of what was emerging in the present. So in a sense, we do the same, but something new also always at that emerging edge. But I've also been interested in looking at this through an evolutionary lens, and looking at philosophers like Teilhard de Chardin, and his work really speaks about this time as having unique properties, and that there's something about the planetary, sort of the full planetary covering of the Earth with humanity, and sort of the whole circuit being completed in a sense. He feels that that is unleashing some new potentials, and that just as I think there's, when we think about the idea, as he was saying, and how strange that is when we really get down to like, what is that and where exactly is it? That sort of emergence of ideas, emergence of reflective consciousness, the capacity to project forwards and backwards and into imaginary realms. This was a insane, improbable development. And so too, I feel there is the possibility for more insane, improbable developments. And so I wonder what you think about this Dialogos not just being a return of the philosophical fire, but the emergence of a kind of collective mind practice, and a way of individuals synergistically coming together and giving rise to this collective mind, this collective spirit, in a way that somehow is critically related to this moment in human development and this moment in time.
That was a lot in there.
Sorry, it's a whole essay, a forthcoming essay, but I'm just sort of bringing in a piece of it to.
Yeah, but that was good. First thing I would say is the internet is a very strange invention. We have the capacity now I think we could now really actualize all the hidden dormant possibilities of what I think John Vervaeke would call distributed cognition. Call it the collective mind, the collective spirit. Unfortunately, we are today mostly antagonizing our own opponent processing. But I think the internet is in that sense neutral. We could also use it to enhance the structures of our mind and couple them in such a way that we could really, that this whole process could really catch fire and start growing and evolving much more than it did until now. I mean, again, we are also talking via Zoom. Most people I've talked with in this corner of the internet, I have not seen them in reality. They live all very far away, but it's a very good thing to couple minds together. I mean, right? Universities also did that in a sense in the past, right? When you wanted to study philosophy, you were going to a university city, and there we would then all meet. When you were interested in psychoanalysis in the beginning of the 20th century, then everyone would go to Vienna and be in his circle in the right. And if you're right, Heidegger was the same. But we don't have to travel today anymore, because what links this together is the internet. But that technology has so much more potential, but unfortunately we are just using it for harmful purposes, I think, most of the time. Especially in terms of connection and dialoguing with each other and establishing connections. I think right, I often think also of dating sites. most dating apps are very harmful to the whole mating ecology. That's so that's just one thing. It's also a digression about the kind of like planetary thing. I mean, we are now, right? We are now a planetary humanity, and we see this more and more when there's a crisis, how everything's getting disrupted more and more. You have, I don't know, you have a crisis somewhere in China, and this is disrupting the supply chains all over the world. And what we could realize is how interpenetrating everything actually is, how all things are, how there's really, this is a network of everything. We're not isolated entities, we're not atomistic monistic entities, but it's actually, everything is interconnected in really deeply. And this is also something we could realize today. I think this will take time. This will take time, but eventually we may be able to realize all of this. It still takes time, I think, but I think we are in a transition age. I mean, either we keep doing what we're doing, then I think we're not surviving. Really, but this technology is too powerful and we're not surviving. Then there's a very good talk by Sam Vaknin that he did recently, and he said our evolutionary defaults are exposed at this time, because this is an age of splitting. Like there are splits going through everything, through our minds, through ourselves. We often do not have a notion of a unified self, an organic self. Like think of a Jungian kind of like architecture of the self. There's the self, and there's the ego, there's the shadow, and the other things, the anima and whatnot. It's a very Platonic way of thinking about the psyche as a kind of multi-layered entity that's also not enclosed, but it's very expansive, right? It's very open. But there's like split going through the self, and there's a split going through families and marriages and the cultures themselves, friendships, politics, obviously. And there are just some statistics out there that are very frightening. And we either keep doing this, or we really let ourselves be transformed by all these practices and create new ecologies and new ways of seeing and being in the world. And then I think humanity could really evolve in that sense. But I'm not because technology is developing so rapidly, and it seems to me that it's often we are not most people are not aware of this danger and kind of captured in that sense, right? Deleuze, for example, talks about the capturing of technology. Technology is capturing us, and we just let that happen. And that's a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, I really appreciate the sense of just how much we're constituted by relationship that's coming through in that. And then with that, like these technologies have sort of predatorily inserted themselves into the space in between relationship in a really detrimental way. And the dating app is a perfect example. It's like as soon as you become single and you're feeling desire, some sort of thought shortcut is happening where it's like, oh, now I have to go on the app. And it's really predatorily jumped in there.
Or pornography, where you cultivate a parasitic relationship to yourself, which is also not very good.
Yes, and we could talk for 2 hours about that too. Yeah, there's a lot of depth underneath these predatory surface level phenomenon and addiction and behaviors. Um, one of the I like to really look for the I look to understand these big problems in phenomenon that I can see immediately around me. And so one of those has been like litter. And I'm really interested in the phenomenon of litter and like what that expresses about um, our relationship to nature and relationship to land.
Yeah.
One other thing that was coming up for me when you were talking about sort of the very recent abandonment of Latin and Greek in Austria and Germany was the beauty of the language in terms of how the font of the language, how it's given appearance has changed so radically as well. Like Germanic script to me seems to have been one of the most beautiful script forms ever written, and there's all of this like folk culture richness in it. And then in the course of the last 100 years, suddenly everything looks like Microsoft Word, sort of really low quality. Everything has become this sort of flattened rendering of that. And why is that the case? And what might we do to come to a place where the beauty itself is a really important aspect of life?
No, I mean, this is again writing. Johannes from the Halykon Guild, he often says, the first thing you should do is pick up your pen and buy a notebook and start writing. Mm. Even that's kind of like embodied writing practice slowly changes, let's say, your structure of cognition. And artistic writing, calligraphy, has been done both in the West and in the East, and is very revered art. And there's, I think John Haveki said this, that there are these experiments by cognitive science when you have a text and it's like the font is not good, and it's like that the paper is maybe blurry or so. It's like it's not like as if the ink had run out halfway through printing the text. We can actually not get the information properly or as quickly as it's a well structured, well designed text with the font and everything. So just the layout, let's say, of the text also changes how you relate to the text. And so it is, I think, maybe calligraphy can bring us to appreciate even deeper layers of what is actually in the words themselves. In Japanese, there's a nice word called kotodama. This is the word soul. Even the words have souls. They're not just static entities of information. And this is also something you can learn in the Dialogos practice. Voices and words have shapes and structures and textures and tastes. And that's something that doesn't sound, I don't know, sounds esoteric, I guess, for modern ears. That's something you can really also get when you really practice this kind of way of dialoguing, and also then writing.
Yeah, it's I really love what you said about the word soul, and it feels like the word coming for me is the enchantment.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like the enchantment of the word itself has been sort of denuded or stripped away or something, and
Mm,
somehow this um, we individually and together have the potential, which is awesome. We have the potential to re-enchant
yeah,
reality,
yeah.
even in a small, subtle way. In one conversation, you and I can begin to like draw that magic
Mm,
out of what is already here. And then we go out and we see it. And the thing, being where I am in Birch's Garden Land, it's very beautiful, and there is this mountains and Catholic churches and so on. But I also have a really felt sense of the disconnection from the nature, the disconnection from the land. All of the forests are managed. There aren't any wild forests here, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
think this says a lot about the culture itself. And so part of what I wonder and hope somehow is that simply through re-enchanting my own senses, that I am actually somehow affecting the land
Mm,
or creating that possibility in the land itself by virtue of me bearing witness to it, by me appreciating the rivers,
mm,
appreciating the spirit of the river, by singing in the forest and so on, like that this somehow, is one step back in the direction of reawakening to it.
mm. Yeah,
And
what
that's
you
like a super edgy metaphysical area. It's quite mysterious, and I certainly couldn't prove it, but at a soulful, intuitive level, it feels the case to me.
mm. Yeah, what like Heidegger, for example, I mean, he said this in his way. Nature is showing just a standing reserve. And one famous example he used is, for example, the Rhine River in Germany. The Rhine River is not showing as the river anymore, but showing as a quite a like a rivering water where we can put um, water plants and electric plants so we can use it for our energy planning or so. That's how the river shows. Like it shows itself as a touristic attraction. And then you have whole companies of marketing agencies that want to market that city or that river. And then, but then often again, the river as itself doesn't show, or the city as itself doesn't show in that sense when you're bombarded with this kind of thinking. So there are very but you can also think about the climate crisis, for example. The danger is not so, right? We think today, and we often just think in terms of this is a technical problem, we have to solve it with technology.
Mm-hmm.
But there's almost no talk about, yeah, maybe how about, for example, re-enchanting nature? that is not an idea that comes into our minds. That's also, by the way, the reason why Heidegger in the late 60s had this essay called The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking. For him, philosophy found its natural place of end with the technicized sciences, and philosophy is now, in analytic philosophy, is just like we kind of like a helping science that provides epistemology and maybe a little bit of formal logic or so, and helps with all of that. but it has ended insofar as that one form of knowledge has become absolutely dominant, and that would be the sciences, and with that, this kind of knowledge where we just see again nature as a standing reserve that's driven by techniques and the sciences.
Mm.
And let's say other forms of knowledge, poetry, dialogue, dialectic in the really Socratic sense, let's say, art, religion, all of these forms of knowledge have become crushed by this overarching dominance of the sciences. And with that, then a sort of thinking that he would call calculative thinking would take over, where we just manage and calculate and steer. But that form of knowledge is insufficient if we want to, if we just re-cultivate the richness of the human experience. And so for him, it's not so much a danger about this talk about climate change, for example. But if we would only think about climate change and all the problems of human life in a sense of technical way, that would then, and this way of thinking is accepted as the only one, then that would be really the great problem. So it's also about again, this is what we are trying to do, bringing back again to life other forms of thinking that are outside of that very dominant technological thinking that is also now very strong around the planet. And in education, if young people are only taught that form of thinking and not other forms of thinking, then that's then really a problem, because it takes a long time to cultivate dialogical thinking, dialectic thinking, or what Heidegger called this meditative thinking is usually the translation. We really go what the Greeks did, basically, where we heed the phenomena, try to save the phenomena, whatever shows up, that we are mindful of it and we can mind it and sense it and be care for it. It's this whole issue with care and being and time. So this that we care for the world, I would say, and that care is never there in technical thinking, according to Heidegger.
Yeah, I mean everything. I really love this whole thread because it pulls together a lot of like my world right now. I mean, especially Germany as a country, like exemplifies this approach of technology is going to fix all of the climate problems, and it somehow is an expression of the kind of mind that has developed here, and so there is this need to go deeper. I think it's rather than technologically solve the problem of why people throw garbage in the river, but rather get down to why do they see themselves as separate from the river, or why do they not perceive the river. And it seems like a lot of roads are pointing to Heidegger for me right now, because I had like Heidegger coming up in all of my conversations in the last week, and so I've probably got more study to.
I've read a lot of Heidegger, and Heidegger is also coming up in every single seminar from the Japanese course for some reason. I mean, Heidegger is also the one. There's a really strong nearness, let's say, to Japanese thinking in general, and the Japanese have recognized this very early, because Heidegger had Japanese visitors already in the 1920s, so that's 100 years ago, very long ago, and they really felt a strong nearness in his way of thinking. what do I want to say? In Japan, it's very interesting. People there, in a stronger sense than here in the West, they learn how that the environment is not separate, but that you, in a sense, you belong to it. You co-create the world. You're not, again, we are not these atomistic entities, and we are enclosed in our bodies, and we are all separate from each other. But it's a more kind of, let's say, holistic thinking that appreciates connectivity and everything. And when you go to Japan, it's really striking that you hardly find garbage on the floor. They really train to kind of be caring about the environment. Now, that technological form of thinking is still very dominant, and nature is more and more becoming entrenched into these circuits of energy production, steering, planning, etc. But I, in my experience, had this feeling that when you go into nature, there was a feeling, okay, this is another world, and we treat it with reverence, and there are some spirits dwelling here. And
yeah.
And I think in some of the Japanese pop cultural artifacts, Ghibli movies or other forms of stories, myths, films, etc., that this awareness that nature is not just empty and dead material, but it's much more than this. This comes through very strongly, at least in my experience.
Yeah. I was watching an anime film called Princess Kaguya. It's not a Ghibli film, but it's really beautiful. And there was a scene in it in which she's sort of visiting a mountain village, and the villager is all the villagers, they live there, they cut down the bamboo, and then one day they leave for 10 years, and she's asking, why did they leave? And he's like, if they keep cutting down the bamboo, they will kill the soul of the mountain.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, that belief that the soul of the mountain would be killed by just, shaving all the trees off the mountainside, which is sort of what's going on here in Austria and Germany a little bit. Imbuing it with a soul is a really great way to not violate it and strip it and treat it as this standing reserve. I would love it if you could just say a little more about what that standing reserve is. I think I have a sense of what you're saying, and I'm sure there's a 100-page essay about this topic alone. But
I mean, Heidegger is a big topic. This form of so for Heidegger, Techne means coming into appearance. Techne is a way of bringing into appearance, and there are different forms of bringing into appearance. From, let's say, hiddenness into manifestness. Yeah? So an artist can bring, let's say, a cup of tea or like a tea bowl also. Right? The artist brings it into appearance in a certain way. And then it comes with a certain light, not like physical light, but like just how it strikes you, how it flashes to you. When you compare that now, let's say, to like just a tea bowl that's maybe industrially manufactured, kind of like on a conveyor belt, and they all look the same. They come with a different light, they come with a different way of appearing. And for Heidegger, it was that the will to will as kind of like the dominant force in modernity, pushes or urges things into appearance where they are forced to appear in a world less light that makes them or enforces them to enforces them into circuits of planning, steering, and this kind of like technical thinking. So when you go out into the forest, let's say, you do not see the tree as a tree, as it is in its suchness, but you see it as or it is forced to appear by the will to will in such a way that it appears as a resource for whatever, our wood production. You do not see it anymore as the tree as a tree, the river as a river. That kind of like that as structure that's also important in Heidegger, where a thing shows itself as it is in its truth. That's showing in its truth being aletheia, truth for the Greeks. That is not an issue anymore. Instead, again, things are urged into appearance by the will to will. And that means we don't have really a relationship to nature, but we have more a relationship to abstractions that are again enforced by our planning, steering, etc. And yeah, this is when you went and then you see, I don't know, you see you go to a city and you see it on Google Maps, you see it through the lens of the camera, you see it, but or maybe you have some subjective projections onto it, but you never have the capacity in your being that you see that the thing as it is, the phenomena as it is. And myth, right? Myth preceding philosophy, myth and some myth and art and poetry for Heidegger could really help to shelter and protect the phenomena from that or bringing them to light again into this way where they are filled of world, where they are abundant, where they are rich in sense, where we get a sense also of their origin, of their provenance. That is not the case in kind of like when the will to will does the pushing of the appearances into this worldless light. And that pushing into worldless light is this standing reserve. They stand out in a constant being in reserve for whatever we want to do with them.
Yeah.
And let's think of human resources. That also reflects them back in language. How we talk about human resources, and we talk about all sorts of resources all the time. And it's very strange. Yeah. And then you just, right, you can deploy, right? You fire, I don't know, companies fire 10,000 of people, and it's like, I mean, this is not normal, right? Don't think this is normal. This is not normal. And right, this is not really an emotional thing. It's just, we've cut away 1,000 people because we are redeploying or replanning or so, something like this. Everything is very motionless and cold. It's everything. This is not normal. That's all I would say.
Yeah, it's profoundly strange when you begin to notice it, I think. And
also, right, mass tourism, where then masses of people go to these, right, I don't know, cities in Italy or so, and we are all on our smartphone cameras to cultivate our subjective profiles. This is very strange, and it's not normal.
Yeah, it's super hard. It's super hard even for me, with my appreciation, like that hijack of the phone, the desire to try to capture the beauty is always there. And yeah, as I listen to you, I feel like this way of understanding coming through Heidegger, like it allows us to see so many different aspects of the culture that we're living in, whether it's, in Germany, they like to put they like to nail little things with numbers onto all of the trees, which I always found to be absurd, is like putting this little number on a tree as if it represents the tree, all the way up to how, this pandemic was governed is somehow from that same spirit.
And
so
it doesn't work, right?
No, it didn't work. It didn't work. And so, yeah, it's perhaps being revealed more in this time how that way of thinking is
Yeah.
breaking down.
Yeah, it's yes, but because our control over nature and the planet is at the same time so strong, I suspect that it will just continue for some time. Mm-hmm. until maybe we cannot manage anymore all the mess, because this is right, we're managing a mess, or Johannes often calls it, we're managing the nothing, so to say, and we're just doing a lot of things so this whole thing doesn't collapse in itself, but at some point that might be overdue. We have in Japanese, and this is one of the texts we read in my course, is from Tanizaki, who was one of the most important novelists in the 20th century in Japan. We read his essay in praise of shadows. And he was already in the 1930s, he was very aware that with technology, and especially here in the form of electricity, that there was this hotness. He was talking about this hotness of things, and that things are losing their depth and they're becoming more flat. And this was somehow this came together with this sun, that the cities were lit up all the time, which is also not a normal thing, that our cities are, right? And there are all these advertisement boards everywhere, and they are flashing everywhere. But he was really saying that we have to let the shadow have a part in our culture again. Shadows being those places that are unaffected also by technology. We just leave them. They're just right the dark, right, the parts in the forest. There's no light, no technology, nothing human. We just leave them alone, so to say. And yeah, so he had a very strong aesthetic sensibility, in the sense that something is really changing also in our attitude with the world. And then I added, right, we do not know the consequences when you, for example, when you light up a city 24 hours. And what happens is that also the population in the city becomes tired, exhausted. Think of Japan and overworking, for example. It's a huge thing. And it's killing off the society very slowly, because people are just tired then of having babies, and you're just in the workplace all the time, and your birth rates are plummeting in South Korea and Japan, and people are just overburdening themselves with debts, and like life satisfaction statistics are not very promising. So it's having it's having very strong effects on these societies.
No, I feel like um, there's so many dimensions of
And we
this.
haven't even started about war, because when people become disintegrated in such a way, they are also highly susceptible to ideological manipulation. And then you can start a war at any time. And that's what happened, I think, in the 1920s and 1930s. Right? There were preceding, let's say, the Great Wars, were years of massive disruption. Right? Think of the high inflation in Germany that was slowly disintegrating the society, and that they were also very punished a lot. They couldn't really revive after the First World War because the measures against them were so strict. And then you just create so much turmoil within the inner conflict within the societies, that then they can also that can all be weaponized very easily. And I think we also see this as well playing out again nowadays.
Mm.
Again, is with the pandemic. Like if you create measures that are so harming, let's say, the social fabric, and creating all these anxieties and loneliness and whatnot, and you're just people are just more susceptible to ideological manipulation. And what then happened is that all these ideologies will just fight against each other. And that happened in Japan as well in the 1930s, like with Marxism and communism and all of that. And national, right? Communism / Marxism, and then you have nationalism at the other end.
Mm. Yeah, I think we'll have to continue the conversation with this exploration of war. Like I know that we're going to have a fuller conversation on it at some point. But I think there's a lot of through lines from the wars to this disenchantment of nature and this disenchantment of language that we've been talking about today. And I also want to sort of, bring my sense that there are great tools at our disposal as well. And this psychoactive dialogue is one of those tools of re-enchantment, and the full potential of it is yet to be known. As we journey into it, we are discovering what's possible in dialogue, and as you say, these mystical properties becoming once more available in disenchanted modernity. I'm also doing some project around conscious cannabis, and very interested in how psychedelics can play a role in this and relationship to nature. And so just as we have this sort of standing reserve culture from bottom to top, we can also have this ecology of re-enchantment from bottom to top as well. And it's an amazing sort of meeting of the two in this time.
It's there's still room for hope. The will to will in all this structure that I tried to describe and outline with the standing reserve, that is not an absolute structure. Otherwise, we couldn't talk about if it would be absolute. It has an exclusive character. It doesn't like other forms of knowledge. This is what I tried to explain with the languages. Right? We want to get rid of them because they do not fulfill the purpose of usefulness, and that we, for example, want in the labor market or so, in a labor circuit, when we think about things in that way that I tried to describe. But we still have room for, let's say, bringing back art, bringing back religion, bringing back dialogue, bringing back also, let's say, those really shamanistic practices that maybe come from, right, ayahuasca, psilocybin, all of that kind of like shamanistic spirituality. There are also, these things are also opening up very slowly. So that's also my hope, that we can at least we may not have, I mean, this may not become dominant in the culture, but if there's a lively subculture again, and that subculture is grounded in itself and has an awareness maybe also of what it's doing, and is slowly drawing people in, then we could create something that is also viable for the future and future generations, I guess.
Feels like a beautiful landing note to end it on. So thank you, Daniel, for joining me.
Thank you as well. This was very nice.
Awesome. Looking forward to the next one.
Yes.